Hello, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old justice-seeking, faith-based policy and organizing network. Our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be God's agents of justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we're so excited to continue in our webinar series, co-hosting with our dear partners, United Methodist for Kairos Response. UMKR is a movement for Palestinian human rights, whose goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. To achieve that goal, United Methodist clergy and laity engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education to help our church and society understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their liberation struggle. As Christians, the advocates in UMKR believe God has called us to this justice-seeking, peacemaking work. A few announcements for our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. You can find it on both MFSA and UMKR's YouTube pages, websites, and in our email newsletters as well. As you have questions throughout the webinar, you can go ahead and type them in the chat at any time. You don't have to wait until we get to the specific Q&A section, and you can direct those questions to myself. I'll show up in the chat as Methodist Federation for Social Action. And we do offer closed captioning. It is automatically generated, so do expect, it's not perfect, so do expect it to be, have some errors in spelling and grammar and such. Our moderator today is Teresa Basile. Teresa is a co-founder of UMKR and the UMKR Communications Director. She is currently a member of the board of FOSNA, Friends of Sabile North America, and previously served on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. She also serves on the leadership team of MFSA in the California Pacific Conference and the leadership team of the Western Methodist Justice Movement. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you, Bridget. And let me say again, welcome to everyone who's joined us today. It's great to see you, so many people here with us. We could not be gathering today for a more timely topic than we have. As we know, representatives from around the world have gathered in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, a few hundred kilometers away from our speaker today. And they will be discussing and hearing reports on the climate crisis that our entire world is facing. Many of these leaders have acknowledged the emergency the world is facing, but very few nations have come through with the necessary actions to avert the worst scenarios that we've been warned about. As we know, those scenarios are happening already, and they are especially impacting the most vulnerable, the most marginalized communities in the world. Communities, indigenous communities in particular, are bearing the brunt of environmental injustice and climate change, and nowhere is that more true than in Palestine. Environmental injustice is becoming a crucial human rights issue for the world, and I have no doubt it will be a key topic at COP27, although many of us might doubt that Palestine will be mentioned there, as it should be. So that is our topic today: how a vulnerable and oppressed population, the indigenous population of Palestine, are being affected by environmental injustice, as well as the global changes that are happening to all of us, and how they are striving to protect the land they love while they also struggle for liberation. We are so privileged to have as our speaker on this topic one of Palestine's leading voices on Palestinian activism and resistance, Mazen Qamsiyeh, who is also an authority on the natural world of Palestine and environmental justice. Mazen is a zoologist and geneticist by training. He teaches and researches at Bethlehem and Birzeit universities. He previously served on the faculties of the University of Tennessee, Duke University, and Yale University. He and his wife, Jessie Cheng, returned to Palestine in 2008, where they founded Palestine's first Museum of Natural History, as well as the Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability at Bethlehem University. He is a renowned human rights defender, and Mazen has lectured around the world on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Palestinian liberation struggle. He has personally been harassed and arrested for his nonviolent activism, and he has also received several prestigious peace and human rights awards. In addition to hundreds of articles published in news outlets, journals, and collections, Mazen is the author of several books, including, notably, Sharing the Land of Canaan, Human Rights and the Israeli-Palestinian Struggle, and Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment. So welcome, Mazen. Thank you so much for giving us your time, especially at the time it is for you, I believe about 8 o'clock in the evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I would like to launch right into our topic now and ask you first about something that I first heard as a child, and many of us have heard all of our lives. People speaking about the remarkable thing that was done when Israel was founded. That Jews came from Europe to a barren desert called Palestine, and through hard work and ingenuity, they made the desert bloom. In fact, they turned that desert into a garden. Now, I have learned more on that subject since then, and I know, as many of us here today do, historically, Palestine was a green and fertile land and was renowned for its produce and the beautiful natural environment. And we know that it is not better off today than it was back then. Can you help us understand more clearly from an environmentalist viewpoint what really happened when Israel was founded? What impact has that colonization and development had on the ecology of Palestine?
Sure. Thank you. Maybe I will share a few slides about the subject that you just raised. So if you'd allow me just to share my screen with you. As you mentioned, Palestine, of course, is the Fertile Crescent. That's where humans first developed agriculture about 12,000 years ago, 10,000 BC. First humans domesticated things like wheat, lentils, barley, chickpeas, etc. So Palestine is indeed very rich habitat and very rich area. And it's this reason for it being in what's called the Fertile Crescent has to do with its geography and its geology. And if you look, even humans migrated out of Africa through Palestine. And even today, birds migrate back and forth between Eurasia and Africa through this bottleneck, which we call Palestine, which is the intersection of continents. And indeed, if we look at the global hotspots for biodiversity, we find that Palestine, the western part of the Fertile Crescent, is considered as a hotspot for rich biodiversity in the same way that the Amazon or other areas, as you see on this map, are rich biodiversity. And this is also documented historically, of course, for example, in Mesopotamian reliefs in the middle or hieroglyphics in the top, where you always see Canaanites, our ancestors. More proper pronunciation would be Canaanites or Canaan. The word actually means, Canaan means satisfied with their lot in life because they had rich resources. So even thousands of years ago in these ancient diagrams, it shows our ancestors as having rich habitat and rich biodiversity. And also, you know from your Bible that it speaks about the land of milk and honey. And that was long even before the Hebrews or Israelites or any of those other tribes came about. So this is very well known about our country. It's also not only rich in biodiversity, it's also rich in human diversity. This is, for example, a picture in 1932, religious leaders of Jerusalem gathering to protest the Balfour Declaration. And you can see, of course, the diversity of the people. Palestine has always been multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, but also even multilingual. There were more than 44 languages spoken in Palestine before 1948. So this is the land. And before 1948, 75% of Palestinians were subsistence farmers. They lived off the land. Now about 4.1% of us are subsistence farmers, but that's because of the political situation. But to go to your question, directly, when we think about the impact of what happened in the last 75 years or so, it's dramatic, and it's I don't have too much time to go through it. I'll just cite a few examples. When Israel was created and ethnically cleansed the local native people in Palestine, so that today 8 million of us Palestinians are refugees or displaced people. In this process, Israel destroyed more than 500 communities, more than 500 villages and towns. And in place of those villages and towns, and in place of all the agricultural lands around them and the wild forests around them, which they also bulldozed, they planted pine trees. And pine trees are kind of okay in Europe, at least Northern Europe. But in here, it was a big problem because they replaced the rich agricultural diversity, rich plant forest diversity, whether planted trees like almonds and figs and olives, or whether they are wild trees like oaks, hawthorn, carobs, etc. They destroyed all of that, and they planted a monoculture of European pine trees, Pinus halepensis. As I said, the European pine trees are okay in Europe. They're not okay here because a monoculture in a very dry climate is also, especially pine trees, are more subject to fires. And we've been having a lot of fires in the areas that were replaced, that the trees were destroyed and replaced with those pine trees. So basically, these fires, for example, here in West Jerusalem, you can see that the fires actually exposed, after burning all the pine trees, exposed the Palestinian terraces that were built by our ancestors, where different plant species were planted. Another thing that Israel does is, of course, pollute our environment. For example, with industrial settlements that dump their toxic waste on us. And my students study this impact of settler colonialism on the environment. So we have studied, for example, the genotoxic effect of Israeli industrial pollutants on Palestinian villagers, showing there's increased chromosome breaks and DNA damage that lead to things like congenital birth defects, cancer, infertility, skin disorders, lung disorders, and so on. Israel has also diverted the waters of the Jordan Valley from Lake Tiberias in the north to the west, replacing much of the fields that were rain-fed agriculture like wheat and barley and so forth, with basically irrigated agriculture. So the answer, I guess, is not that they made the desert bloom, they had what's called the replacement agriculture, or replacement system. So instead of diverse trees, have monoculture of trees, or instead of rain-fed agriculture, they had irrigated agriculture. But the diversion of the waters of the Jordan Valley has actually caused the shrinkage of the Jordan River basin and desertification to spread to the north, as you see in the satellite image on the right. There was drainage of the wetlands in the Hula area, which resulted in the destruction of the Palestinian villages in those areas, ethnically cleansed, and then destruction of habitats for 219 species that disappeared in this area thanks to this. This is just to show you, the red line, by the way, is the marcation of the 300 mm desert regions or semi-arid regions in Palestine. And so Israel did not increase even 1 hectare of green areas in Palestine, and the opposite, they increased desertification coming up the Jordan Valley, which you see in between Lake Tiberias, that's closer to us in this image, and the Dead Sea Lake, or Lake of Lot, as it's called in the south. I just skip some slides. This is just to show you the Jordan River, for example. It went down from 1,350 million cubic meters per year to only 20 million cubic meters per year. It's no longer a river. It's basically a small polluted stream that is about, in some places, only 1.2 meters, or about 3 feet or so, or 4 feet in width, when it was actually a river before. So, I mean, I could cite many, many other examples of this devastation of our environment. So Israel did not make the desert bloom, and the data for this are plentiful. Our team actually studies these areas and can show you these data and demonstrate this. Israel still continues, of course, to demolish trees and Palestinian trees, and Palestinians still try to cling to their land. I'll stop here for this part of the question that you asked about Israel making, quote unquote, the desert bloom.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fascinating. That history of Palestine's natural biodiversity and the long-time human diversity was fascinating. Thank you also for explaining the damage that's been done by what you called replacement agriculture. That was a new term for me. And the harm that's been done, not just to the land, but to the health of the people there. I have one tiny question before I get to the next major question, a question about something you just said, the Jordan River. That extreme depletion of the river, is that just a natural development of what is happening around the world with climate change, or is that also directly attributable to policies in the area?
No, this was directly related to the diversion of the water, which I showed here. You can see they took water from upstream of the Jordan Valley, from Lake Tiberias, and they diverted it to the west. And that was intentional de-development of the Jordan Valley. It was intentional de-development because the Palestinians lived on the West Bank, which is West Bank of Jordan, if you want, and also on the East Bank, Jordanians and Palestinians. Many of the, of course, people of Jordan are Palestinian refugees. So Israel wanted to starve these Palestinians on both sides of the Jordan Valley of their water. That's why they diverted it to the west. It was an intentional de-development of the Palestinian communities on both sides of the Jordan Valley.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. Can you tell us some more about the most recent events there and how they are impacting Palestinians, and specifically in light of our topic, environmental injustice there, and other ways in which the policies of Israel currently are impacting Palestinians as you struggle to deal with climate change.
Well, I mean, to step back just a little bit, I want to just say something. As you mentioned, my background is medical genetics. So I like to always make a diagnosis for the situation. What's the diagnosis here when you have 500 Palestinian villages and towns, which you see in the red dots here, destroyed or ethnically cleansed, and to have laws like this, which makes any Jew anywhere in the world can come here and get automatic citizenship, whereas 8 million Palestinian refugees or displaced people have no right to come back to their own country. What is the diagnosis here? What is the problem when you have shrinking of land, as you see here on the map on the top, which some of you may have seen, shrinking map of Palestine? You would be surprised actually at the origin of the shrinking map of Palestine. It came about in 1998 when my son, who was going to middle school in North Carolina, saw the shrinking map of the US where the natives ended up in reservations or small areas, as you see on the bottom. And he asked me, well, isn't this what happened in your country? I said, no, this is what happened in your country. But then he said, well, shouldn't you draw one like this for Palestine? I said, well, why don't you draw one like this for Palestine? So he did. He drew that in 1998, and many people use it, shrinking map of Palestine. And this is what happened in South Africa also with the Bantustans, ghettos that were left for the Black people, which is actually 11.5% of the land of South Africa. In our case, it's 8.3% what's left for us. This is the diagnosis. The diagnosis is settler colonialism. And it's important to make the right diagnosis to understand the symptoms, which you asked me about what's happening now, because all the symptoms, and I could speak endlessly about the symptoms of what's happening right now. I'll cite a few examples, but my point is the symptoms are easily understandable if you have the diagnosis or the context, which is settler colonialism and what settler colonialists naturally do by the nature of the word settler colonialism. And you all are familiar with that, so I don't have to tell you about the symptoms, including the vilifying of the natives, the violence against the natives, the resistance by the natives, the destruction of their lives and livelihood. For example, the killing of 2 million buffaloes in North America. That's all understandable symptoms of settler colonialism. And the same symptoms can be found here, and I could enumerate them for you. The violence, for example, that killed 100,000 native Palestinians, more than 100,000. More than 800,000 injured, more than 900,000 detained. Just in 2021, 91 children actually were killed by the Israeli colonizers. These are all symptoms. So if let me just take the past 2 weeks, for example. Well, the past 2 weeks, at least 15 Palestinians were killed. So on average, about one a day. We had home demolitions. We had people removed off their land confiscated. We have olive groves that were demolished, just in the last 2 weeks I'm speaking. Olive groves that were demolished, destroyed. We had olives that were stolen even because this is the season of harvesting, and the settlers even wait till the Palestinians harvested their olives and then went and stole the bags of olives from them. We had the usual denial of movement and denial of medical care that resulted in deaths of people who seek medical attention, whether from Gaza or from the West Bank. And I could go on and on. I mean, I'm sure you don't want to hear too much about this. It can be very depressing. I do want to say that there's also environmental damage. We mentioned some of it, but these are the typical 6 environmental threats that face us humans. And of course, they all affect Palestine, including settler colonization. I gave you examples of this. But we have climate change, over-exploitation of natural resources, pollution, habitat destruction, invasive species, wars, conflict. Now you mentioned Sharm el-Sheikh earlier as a meeting on climate change. I mean, I want to just, give you just one simple fact. The West Bank and Gaza, which are supposed to become a Palestinian state, has 4.5 million Palestinians. The total greenhouse gases that we emit as Palestinians is less than what the Israeli army alone emits for greenhouse gases. Just that small fact should make you ponder. And of course, we get the brunt of these things like climate change.
Thank you. That was very enlightening too. This is an excellent list for us to refer back to. I'm wondering if you could say, before we go to the next major subject, say a little bit more about over-exploitation. What resources are being over-exploited and in what ways?
Well, I mean, let's take the issue of water, for example. This is water. Water is not, there's no shortage of water here, but there is unequal distribution. You can see from this graph alone, there's actually a typographical error in the right side for Gaza. Gaza gets 9 liters per day of water, not 90, because you can see 73 in the West Bank. Their settlers get many, many folds more water. And while we are denied basic water for showers, even for drinking, settlers have green ponds, green pools they swim in. They even have here in Bethlehem, there's a settlement in which Avigdor Lieberman has a nice villa. And this settlement has a water park in it even. And green lawns and things like that. And meanwhile, we end up with water shortage for the Palestinians, getting less than what the World Health Organization says for healthy living, which is 100 liters per person per day on average. Actually, the people of Gaza get only 9, so it's less than 1/10 of what the World Health Organization says is reasonable for healthy living. If I look at natural resources like, gas, for example, here's gas fields. Israel is using the gas fields off the coast, the Palestinian coast, including of Gaza, by the way, and now beginning to export it to Europe to replace Russian gas. And that's the reason Gaza is besieged, by the way, the reason Gaza is besieged and fishermen cannot go more than 6 miles into the Mediterranean Sea is because at 6 miles is the beginning of Marine B, as it's called, which is the closest gas field off the coast of Gaza. This is being stolen and overexploited by the Israelis instead of giving the resources to the native people. And there are many other examples, Dead Sea minerals, for example, everything, water from springs for agriculture is being exploited. All our natural resources are basically for the use of the colonizers, not for the use of the indigenous native people.
Thank you. That was really helpful too. Before I move into our next major topic, I have one other follow-up question. In light of everything that you've been showing us, what do you think of the fact that Israel actually cultivates an image worldwide as a very green or environmentally conscious society? I've even seen it promoted as an environmental leader for the world. Some would call this greenwashing. Can you say anything more about that to us, about what is greenwashing and where are you seeing it come up?
Yeah, I go back to my diagnosis of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism always projects itself as good for the land, as good for the area that it came into. And that's natural as propaganda tool for the colonialists. Now, facts are, of course, different, and facts can be easily determined from, peer-reviewed scientific research. For example, it's not very difficult to find how many pine trees were planted by the Israelis versus how many olives, figs, almonds, hawthorn, oaks, and other trees they uprooted. For example, just to build the segregation wall in the West Bank, Israel uprooted over 2 million fruiting trees. These data are available and people can look them up if they want to. The problem is that Western media, subservient to Zionist interests, tries to hide the facts and will not show you the reality on the ground. People who come here, they can see reality and they can see what's happening environmentally or in terms of trees or anything else. But also scientific literature is available. But in terms of what they project to the Western media, which is largely under their influence, they can project what they think will work for advancing the Zionist project, which, as I said, is taking a country that was biologically diverse and had also human diversity and making it a monolithic society and even monolithic plant distribution. How many species of plants became extinct as a result of the Zionist invasion? This can be easily traced, and my students and I do actual research on this and publish it. Greenwashing is something, needs to be combated, but needs to be combated with facts and figures, not with emotional, ideas.
Thank you. That's helpful too. And about the work that you do and what you've written, we are putting some things in the chat, a few publications of yours, and also links to your institute so people can follow your work on your website and on Facebook. So we will have that information included with the videos when we post this webinar online. So you mentioned that greenwashing needs to be combated. And of course, the damage that is being done to the land and has been done for 70 plus years needs to be reversed. I know that you and other Palestinians are working to heal the land, to try to restore, to at least lessen the damage that is continuing every day. So can you tell us more about your work in that vein? And if you could also, as part of that, share with us what we might be able to do to help, to be supportive of your efforts, that would be great.
Thank you. Yes, so that's actually, the more uplifting part of this conversation, because if we focus just on the illness, on the disease and all its symptoms, we can get very depressed. But if we focus on the aspects that are positive and what people have been doing, not just us, of course, millions of Palestinians that are active, that are trying to survive and are surviving and doing very well in some places, and of course, less well in other places. But just to answer your question about what we are doing and what people can do help us is you have to realize for us Palestinians, the key element is resistance. And this is existential for us. We cannot, of course, I would not be here speaking to you from Bethlehem, birthplace of Jesus, if it was not for resistance of my ancestors who refused attempts at ethnic cleansing, etc. My grandmother from Nazareth who came to Bethlehem and then refused to leave in 1967 when Israel expanded into this area. I wouldn't be here if it was not. I would probably be born in Jordan or Lebanon or Syria as a refugee. So the mere existence of us on this land is a form of resistance. When I'm drinking this cup of tea here in Bethlehem, I'm engaged in resistance because the Zionist project doesn't want that. It wants a monolithic society. It doesn't want the Christians or Muslims or others here. My family happens to be a Palestinian Christian family from the Shepherd's Field here, Beit Sahur, just next to Bethlehem, where our ancestors were those shepherds that heard the angels sing, went up to Bethlehem. So everything we do is a form of resistance. But sometimes it takes more than just simply mere existence. And we have a word in Arabic called sumud, which is a bit more than resilience or persistence. It's active resistance and sort of like this frog, if you want. So it's an attempt to say, look, we want to live in our country and we want to live in dignity in our country and we want to build for our children. And to do this, there are many things that we have been doing. Our institute, for example, which is, here's a picture of the institute from a drone image. And by the way, I'm not allowed to have drones, but we do have a drone. So anyways, we have solar power, we have botanic garden, we have a community garden. We have, this is just some pictures from the garden area. We have a natural history museum where children come and enjoy exploring biodiversity in Palestine. We have a cultural heritage museum, which tries to revive knowledge of tangible and intangible cultural heritage in Palestine that's related to our ancestors, Canaanites, who developed agriculture, as I mentioned. We work with children of all ages. We work with women. For example, women activists here, they learn how to make cosmetics or other material, soap, from organic things from the garden or produce their own products. We help them market them in marketplaces. This is empowerment activities for people. We work with farmers, for example, to increase their resilience on the ground. As I mentioned, only 4.1% of Palestinians are now subsistence farmers. So we actually want to increase that number, but also the ones who are and are struggling, we want to show them how they can increase their production. And so we have projects like this, which helps farmers increase their production without using pesticides and insecticides, organically produced substances. We show them through models, for example, like aquaponics. And we even brought some people from Gaza and showed them how to build aquaponic systems, which help you basically raise fish and vegetables at the same time in the same system. And this is very helpful because Israel took most of our water and most of our land. So it's this aquaponic systems help raise in small areas, and most of the water ends up in either inside the fish or inside the vegetable rather than evaporate. We have a community garden where even refugee children, as you see in the lower right-hand corner, can come and grow their own vegetables in the garden and again feel empowered by this. This is just some of the work with the children that we have at this institute through summer camps or other activities. Like, for example, the one in the upper left-hand corner, some girls who recycled trash to make gifts from it, plastics and stuff like that. The children enjoy themselves working here, feeling empowered in our institute, getting in touch with nature, land of Palestine, learning to explore, learning critical thinking more. We have Chinese have a saying, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So we want them to be doing things, as you see, touch, feel, enjoy, explore. And they have a lot of fun, even harvesting olives and making olive pickles and other things. And here again, you see children enjoying themselves. So our project is by nature, it's resistance. Even though most of what we are doing is not direct like confrontation with Israeli soldiers or anything, just by learning, by doing research, by tending a herbarium, doing field work, planting things, harvesting things, working in the garden. This is all activities that are forms of resistance. And we are challenging those major threats that face humanity, as I said, climate change, etc. We work with the Palestinian Environment Authority, Environmental Quality Authority, Palestinian Ministry of Agriculture, others, climate change systems, both locally and globally for mitigation, adaptation. We even have a small group called Palestine Action for the Planet, which is part of Extinction Rebellion, if you know what Extinction Rebellion is, Greta Thunberg and those guys with her. And so we work on all these things. We work locally to promote diversity. And many of our volunteers have already come from 45 countries to work with us. Our staff are diverse in age and gender and religion, and our volunteers are the same. The volunteers enjoy themselves here. We invite you to come and volunteer if you want to come and join us. For example, the volunteers in the upper right-hand corner, a mix of even including this Israeli woman, Zohar. They built this biogas unit in one day, which produces gas from organic decay anaerobic bacteria. So, there's a lot of things that can be done here and are being done here. And this is just a glimpse of our activities, which are many in diverse fields. This is our website, by the way. If you want to learn more, just go on that website, palestinenature.org.
Thank you. That's very good. And I believe by now that has also been shared in the chat. And maybe our person who is doing that can take that little piece of information and do it again. There's a campaign I'd like to mention too. By the way, it was so wonderful to see how you are helping the youngest generation maintain their connection to the land and their love of it and their understanding of how to care for it. And how great that we could have the opportunity to come there and work with you on these activities. UMKR and MFSA are both also justice advocacy organizations. So besides looking for these hands-on opportunities, we look at ways to change things systemically. And in particular, we focus a lot on BDS action. as you heard at the beginning in our introduction. So there is a campaign that UMKR has just adopted as one of ours, and it's from the BDS National Committee, focused on Chevron and Siemens to stop supporting Israeli apartheid and climate disaster. Chevron is one of the main, as I think we all know, main corporate contributors to climate change. And it's the primary extractor of fossil gas for Israel in the Mediterranean. It's also supporting Israel's efforts to create something called the East Med Pipeline, which is a controversial fossil fuel project. Siemens is facilitating Israeli apartheid by building the Euro-Asia interconnector, which is a subsea cable that will link Israel's and Europe's electricity grids, which will directly benefit the Israeli settlements and presumably all of Israel. So the BDS National Committee has this campaign that I am going to put a link for in the chat right now. We would invite you all to take a look at that campaign, and you will be hearing from UMKR in the future about specific actions as part of that campaign that we will call people to take action on. If you have any thoughts about that or other other actions you've heard of, Mazen, please chime in here, or I can move on to another question.
No, I mean, I just want to say that if we take my medical analogy, the most important thing to speed up recovery, like if you had COVID-19 and you have the experience of that, you know that your internal resistance is very important. But you also know that help from outside, vitamins, zinc, whatever, chicken soup is good. So, and it helps you recover faster. So the external help, like in BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, which help accelerate the transformation in South Africa, is also important. And so we certainly, as Palestinians, we consider that very, very important. And it's not just its physical impact on, let's say, Israel and panicking Israel. It's a psychological impact also of showing, you know, oppressed people that you are not alone, that there are people who care about what's going on and understand our responsibility to it. And in the case of US citizens, it's even more important because, as you know, without the US support, Israel wouldn't survive even 2 weeks here. The US is what props Israel with your tax money, with my tax money, by the way. I'm a US citizen, I still pay taxes. So Israel is being funded by the US to the tune of billions of dollars a year. Actually, per capita, per person, Israel gets more than like about 20 states per capita get from federal money. So it's very important for US citizens, in my humble opinion, to counteract this bias from their government and those who claim to represent us in Congress, who end up just shelling money for Israel because they fear the Israeli lobby or they want the Israeli lobby money. I think that's important. It becomes critical.
Thank you. I'm going to move now to some questions that have come from others, and I'm going to see if I, on my own, can stop our screen sharing so folks can see you close up. Let's see if that, did that work for everyone? Okay, and maybe we can see Mazen a little bit closer. Hello. Okay, so some questions that others have been asking. And by the way, I encourage everyone, if you've sent anything to me through the chat, I am not looking at the chat. So just be aware of that. Sometime after all this is over, I may be able to go back and look at it if you had a question for me, but that won't happen during the webinar. However, we do have some questions. Can you say anything more about international or Israeli companies that are exploiting natural resources of Palestine, such as Heidelberg Cement, or any others that you think are worth highlighting? And what action would you suggest? I think you've kind of spoken to that already. You've said BDS is very important. Are there any other companies that come to mind that you would bring to our attention, such as Heidelberg?
Yeah, I mean, again, we can say a lot about each company and its role and so forth. And people can investigate. I mean, there's a website if you want. I'll put it in the chat for everybody to see it, called bdsmovement.net, which is the central BDS website that you can utilize to investigate the role of different companies and corporations and entities that support apartheid, support racism, segregation, and so forth. My point, I mean, I want to just make very important point here. Sometimes people ask me about the cultural boycott and the academic boycott versus the corporate boycott. I don't want us to focus mostly on corporate boycott, even though it is important. I actually think cultural and academic boycotts are equally important and perhaps even more important because it's a moral question. And in the case of South Africa, it was not the economic boycott that brought the elites in white Africa to finally realize that there's no future for apartheid. It was the cultural and academic and other boycott, elite boycotts of South African whites who used to go to the West and used to be welcomed with open arms by Western countries as quote unquote fellow Democrats. And then they started being faced by signs at the airports and even art venues or music venues with signs that says free South Africa and apartheid. That moral pressure, in my humble opinion, is even more important than the financial pressure. Financial pressures, they can always find ways around them. For example, in South Africa, IBM supposedly pulled out from South Africa, but South Africa was getting a lot of its IBM's machines from nearby countries or faraway countries. They managed to always find some ways around them. But I emphasize that, what's useful about these BDS aspects, regardless of how successful a particular action we do, let's say about Chevron or Intel or anything like that, it's more important as a way to reach out, number one, for Palestinians, to show them that you actually do care, reach out for your own conscience so that you are not contributing to violence by buying things, supporting these corporations, etc. So it's mostly inner peace that you receive by doing the right thing, so to speak, no matter how total impact it has or doesn't have. That's to me is what's important about the BDS movement and why we encourage you to participate in it. And the third, as I said, is that it causes the Israelis to think, and the Israelis are starting to panic about the BDS movement, not in terms of its direct impact on them right now and what's happening with their finances or what they call GDP, gross domestic product for Israel, but they panic about it just like with South Africa panicked about it. The South African economy was doing very well even till the last day before the elections for apartheid. but they panicked about it because they saw the trend, they saw what's coming, and they saw that people are serious and people want to challenge oppression and human rights violations.
I totally agree. And I think what you said about the academic and cultural boycott applies just as much to what we call the economic boycott and divestment actions. Their impact has never primarily been economic. I think it's a misconception people have about it, that it isn't worth doing because it doesn't actually have a big economic impact. It doesn't on Israel, it doesn't have a big economic impact on those companies, usually. Sometimes they lose some big contracts, usually not. The impact is always social, moral, political. It sends a message when a church or any other major institution puts their money where their mouth is and says, I'm getting out of this because of Palestinian human rights. The message is heard around the world. And yeah, it makes Israel very uncomfortable. And it reaches leaders' ears and hearts, and it opens hearts and minds when those economic actions are taken out. Thanks very much for addressing that. That was really helpful. I have a different kind of question that we had submitted, and you know what, it's 10:59. Do you have a few more minutes to answer one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, I said 10:59. That's Pacific time, morning in California. Anyway, yeah, it's 1 minute to the hour. Let's put it that way. Okay, I thought this was an interesting question, a different kind of question. Could you share the story of what led you to return to Palestine, to start the Museum of Natural History, the Institute? How is your work there shared outside Palestine? This is a second question from the same person. Shared outside Palestine to help educate internationals like us about the effects of climate change. So how did you come to go back there and do this, and how is your work reaching the world?
Thanks for that question. I mean, I was active actually in the US. I left Palestine to get education in the US, and I did. And as you mentioned, I worked in some universities in the US, like University of Tennessee, Duke, and Yale. And I was doing some activism there, like you guys are doing activism. I was engaged in boycotts. I was engaged in media work, lobbying, working on congressmen, senators, local politicians, doing lectures, educating. We had, for example, something called Wheels of Justice bus tour, which is a bus that was decorated asking for ending the occupation and the interference in the Middle East from the US. And this bus traveled in 5 years between 2000 and 2005, traveled to all 48 states, spoke at over 1,200 colleges and universities, at over 300 or 400 high schools and middle schools, churches, mosques, and even synagogues, a couple of synagogues. We were very successful establishing NGOs and others that work for human rights. So we were doing things for Palestine in the US, but my wife and I felt that we could probably make a bigger splash, if you want, by returning to Palestine and by working here, precisely because of what I mentioned earlier about Israel wanting Palestinians out of Palestine. And being in Palestine, educating our children here, doing things on the ground like planting a community garden or creating a museum, creating a medical laboratory that does those research I mentioned. All of this has impact, and we felt at that stage of our lives that this would be more helpful than staying in the US. Not that staying in the US, we couldn't continue activism. We were doing good activism.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And well, the other part of that question was, how is your work reaching internationals? And there was even a third part of it that I think I will throw in there. Are there special challenges your work personally is facing because of the occupation?
Yeah, Yes, we are reaching a lot of internationals. Even today, I had 3 delegations visit the museum, including a delegation of 17 people from several countries who are part of an exploratory tour group trying to understand what's going on here. One of them happened to be a minister of a European country, served in her country as a minister before. She's retired now. But anyways, we do get a lot of visiting delegations, but we also outreach, as I'm doing now. I'm outreaching to you guys by giving a talk online, and I do that also, regularly. Every week I have 2 or 3 such talks as I'm giving to you. Also by writing to my email list, which incidentally, I have a large email list of over 50,000 people that I send a weekly message to. Some of you may be already on it.
Will you put a link? Would you put a link right now in the chat for people to sign up for that if they'd like to?
Yeah, if they could just email me and ask to join this list, that would be great. I'll put my email in there.
How many people say you have on it now?
More than 50,000.
Fabulous.
Okay. I'll put two emails basically, and one is my own personal email, and one is the email of the institute here, which is, as I said, PalestineNature.org. So you can email me at info@PalestineNature.org. So either of those emails will get to me. And yeah, just email me and just say hi or something, and then I know you want to be on the email list. So what was the second part? There was another part you asked about.
Well, you know what? I think that I think the answer you gave us was tremendous. And because we're 5 minutes after the hour now, I want to try and respect people's time and wrap us up, if that's okay. This was just a wealth of information and insights that you shared with us, and experience and knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope that we'll get to do something with you again in the near future, and that you're going to hear from many of us, I hope, to sign up for your newsletter and maybe even come over there and work with you. So a few of us on the ground. Thank you, everybody who's been here today. I'd like to tell you about one other thing. It was in the chat, and I am putting it again there. The United Methodist Church has a delegation at COP27. And it says it all right there in the announcement that they are going, our agencies have representatives who will be engaging with leaders from around the world to press them for more action. And they are going to be sending us, they're going to be holding 2 webinars to report on what's going on there and their insights about negotiations that they are hearing and meetings that they have been able to be a part of. So there's a link there if you're interested in participating in those webinars so that you can register for them. So this is a big issue, climate crisis in general, for our denomination, for all of the agencies of our denomination. And it is UMKR and our partner MFSA's task to make sure many United Methodists understand what this means for Palestine and the bigger picture of what's happening in the Holy Land. So thank you again, Mazen, for helping us in that mission. And Bridget, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much for our speaker and for our moderator. I want to remind folks that we will be posting the recording soon, so you can find that in the coming few days. And we'll also be sending out more information on our next webinar, which will happen in January. So we won't have a webinar in December. We'll take a break in December, and we will gather back together in January. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.